Go for it.
All right. Hello, my name is Eric Dirks. I'm Vice President of Eventing for the Illinois Dressage and Combined Training Association. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We have a very special guest this evening. He has been a major influence on my horsemanship and many others. He's won countless medals in both Olympic Games, World Championships, Pan Am Games. He's even coached Canada to medals. He's coached the U.S. He has been president of the USCF. He's a course designer, and overall, he's just been a major custodian for the eventing sport and horses in general. Welcome, David O'Connor.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a little embarrassing to hear probably all of that, but yeah. Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to just talking about horses.
Well, you've always struck me as a very humble person and not a very quiet person working behind the scenes. And that's why I just want to share your story with everybody. I've gotten the privilege of working with you briefly when there was the developing riding program. And, I've always saw you on the outskirts competing. We always wanted to emulate you, but to have one-on-one experience with you just opened the door to a whole nother perspective, especially being neighbors in the past and seeing what's going on next door. But I'd like to share with you where you are right now. Obviously, you're not in Switzerland right now. But,
I'm not in Switzerland, right? So, yeah, I'm at Red Hills at this wonderful horse trial that they have down here in Tallahassee, which was such an unusual horse trials because there's such community support. I mean, local support. And fun enough, I went to a store today to buy literally a pair of pants because I ripped some today, and they asked, why? Because I just said I was here for the weekend, and they were like, I said a horse person, oh, you're here for Red Hills. And so it's amazing in the community, local stores have nothing to do with horses, and they know what this is. And that's the fun part about this event. So right now I'm sitting in a hotel room. The hotel room does not look like this, but since you guys showed me how to do a background, I figure I'm going to pick the opposite of Florida right now. So that's what we're doing.
Well, if those are the hills in Florida for the event, I think we have to do a little
exactly. Yeah, it looks just like this. Yeah.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and your start into horses?
Yeah, I mean, it's, my mother was the one that got us involved, both my brother and I. And my brother, we're lucky that we're such an eventing family in some ways, because my brother's, a commentator, as a lot of people know, and in dressage, two sports, dressage and show jumping. So my brother is here this weekend commentating at Red Hills, which is, it's a joy to do a family thing. But Mom started us. She was, my father was not part of horses at all, worked for the Navy, had a fascinating career as a civilian in the Navy life in the submarine department, and had an unbelievable, fascinating whole story of himself, but was not into horses. And Mom was, Mom being British, she was working her way around the world, met my father, they get married, and, suddenly she stays here. And so she got involved in the horse world at a place called the Potomac Horse Center. We lived in Maryland, and where I rode my first time when I was, 8 years old, I think. Brian, so we're a suburban family, small, there's no farm, there's no government employee, there's no background of, this is going to be handed down. But she was very involved, got very involved, rode herself. We were on the ponies, not show kids, but, in the pony club. She became involved in the pony club, which she ended up, at the higher levels. And that's probably something that came back later on to our lives. That's her volunteerism through all of the disciplines. And so it started. And so I would have to say, why did I get involved in horses? Because my mother told me to. And then, suddenly became the pony thing. Both Brian and I have lived in a neighborhood that was quite open at that point, not open anymore, but so we would ride our ponies to our friends and neighbors and play football or baseball or whatever, put all the ponies in the paddock and go up play baseball and have the normal kid thing. But it was the ponies were actually the fastest way to get everywhere. And so that was that's the way we kind of were lucky enough to grow up. And it was, definitely because of my mother, Sally, who took us down this road and we went down. It was great.
You at such a young age too. There, a really interesting story is not maybe many people know. You rode across the U.S. I mean, from East Coast to West Coast. Can you tell us what prompted that, and how old were you? And tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, it's funny how it keeps coming back. It was obviously a very formative thing of me, and I was a kid. So my the conversation started, and actually it's actually fairly interesting because I just watched the documentary on it. My brother had just read Kon-Tiki, and Kon-Tiki was the guy Thor Heyerdahl who put a balsa raft across the Pacific to do as a proving where people came from. And conversation, my mother, said, "Oh, well, no, you can't do that, but you could ride to California." And then that was, when I was 9. And then the more that people said that it couldn't happen, the more my mother said it happened. It has to happen. And then so this is my brother on the far left, and my mother in the middle, and me on the closest. And I was 11, Brian was 13, my mother, and we set out from Maryland and we rode to Oregon. We didn't go through California because of the deserts. And we knew 5 people, or Mom knew, because I'm 11, so I don't know anything. And there's no question I rode across the United States because my mother told me to. And so
how long did that take?
People from Maryland to Lincoln, Nebraska. And then from Lincoln, Nebraska on, we didn't know anybody. And so the whole time we just knocked on doors. And at the end of the night, we were riding down secondary kind of roads. We get to, 5 o'clock and, place on the right, place on the left, and knock on people's doors and say what we were going to do. The funny story about that, east of the Mississippi, everybody's going, "You're going where?" And then west of the Mississippi, everybody goes, "You're from where?"
That's funny.
And then, from Lincoln, Nebraska on, we basically followed the Oregon Trail, which is following the rivers up through Nebraska to Wyoming, into Idaho, and into Oregon from there. And, it's a stunning achievement, a stunning thing that my mother made happen. 2 kids. It definitely worked because, 110 days or so, we knocked on people's doors and asked if we could stay. We only turned down 3 times over the whole time that we were there. But we slept in, stockyards and bleachers and under trees in the Rocky Mountains. And, it was a place of making things happen. And we all think about it a little bit different. It has had a huge impact on my life. I think a lot of it, yes, the horse thing. You spend a lot of time with your horses. And the way that the trip worked, my brother was always out front, 13 years old, probably a little bit rebellious in his time. Mom was always second, and I was always third. And I'd be 100 yards behind them. And I was the lightest, obviously the smallest, and I actually rode the biggest horse and carried the most weight. We carried our own oats, and the saddlebags that you see there had, kind of a change of clothing and things like that. The horses had a halter on. We had a lariat, which I learned to rope quite early. and that'll be other stories later on. But I would say from a human point of view, the respect of how people make a living, huge. The respect of the land is huge because you have time to see it. The solitude side of, because there's no cell phones. This is 1973, by the way. So we're almost all 50, we're 40 years on, 50 years on. So we, no cell phones, no anything like that, no that type of communication, and so that you did have the touch of time, and which I think has had an impact on my life, one way or another, is the sense of time, because the sense of time, I know this is getting a little bit weird, but I would always say that the time is such a big deal in the modern day world. Things have to happen instantly. It's within a second, da, 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 da. And then in this environment, distance becomes more important than time. And distance becomes, that's where I'm going. And I have no idea how long it's going to take us to get there, really. And fun enough, even through all of my life in lots of different aspects, that's something that has stayed with me for a long time, is this is where you're going. This is what you're going to do. I don't know how long that's going to take, but this is the thing that I want to do. And I think that's huge important for horses. And so the horse that you see this picture that I'm on that's closest to you, that's Ralph, what we named Ralph. The middle picture on my mother's horse was her event horse called Gung Ho. And my brother's horse, the one that's looking at you, was named BG. And he was a neighbor's horse that we borrowed, with the oldest, and made it all the way across. The other two, we actually, we had to leave them, which is a whole nother stories, but we had to leave them. And then people gave us horses to continue on, and we actually picked those horses up on the way back. So they were, we didn't ride back, but they came back. And so the farthest one, the oldest one, he was the one that made it. He went all the way, right? Maryland, or 2,800 miles. So.
Wow. And what kind of time frame did that take to go all the way across?
It took, it was 3.5 months. We basically made 30 to 35 miles a day. There were days that which is half an hour in a car. And there were days that we had, the longest day was like 48 miles because we were out west and the town was, we would go to a town and families out to dinner. And so you have a hard time with water and all that good stuff. So we had to go on to the next town. So the longest day that we did, I think, was 48 miles in a single day. So, if you compare it to cavalry days, it's not much of a record, but 48 miles is a long time to stay on a horse. So we basically rode, kind of 7-8 hours a day.
And, and as you grow up, what kind of sparked you into saying that I wanted to be a professional in this sport, or even choose eventing? What kind of sparked that interest?
I would have to say that my mother was always interested in eventing, and then Pony Club, back in the 60s and early 70s was much more, eventing oriented or specific. And so we grew up in that world. And my mother got involved with the people that were around the Olympic Games. The Mike Plums, Jimmy Wofford's, Bruce Davidson's, they were all, in some ways family friends in that area, because we lived in that area. And she got involved as being much more about not just competing, but press. And then she was judging. And so these were people that we grew up with. So I grew up around top level eventing people all the time. From the time I was a kid, and didn't really at that point think that was going to be your life or whatever. I did my first, we did Pony Club things, but probably I did my first registered event, which obviously that was a lot smaller, in 1976. And that would have, I was 14 years old, and did my first, long format, CCI at that point, or 3-day event at that point. I did that in 1978, and so that was I was brought up in that world. I was brought up around that world. These were the people that my mother was involved in, and so that was a world that I was just around all the time, and never really thought at some point that it was going to be a livelihood. Didn't really think you had the money, and et cetera, and still had your ponies, and and so it just kind of turned off this way. I got, you went to a Young Riders, and did well. Jack Legoff, who was the coach, he noticed you, and you knew the people, they knew who you were, and suddenly, the break probably came when I got asked to go to one of those developing rider clinics under Jack. The year after the games, he would always have, and he would go around the country. There'd be 30 people that were picked. And then in those days, he would then pick 3 or 4, and those were the people that were going to be the team people. And at the beginning, the first one was Bruce.
Wow.
And I was the last one out of that program. So Bruce was the first one, and Tad and all those guys, they all came through it. And I was the last one that came out of that program. And it turned that way. It was, it was a special time. And so I went to college under the University of Jack Legoff to learn.
Yeah, we talked a lot about Jack Legoff with Denny Emerson and Jimmy Wofford, and how much influence he has had over riding in the U.S. It's just the amount of riders that came up through that school, and that influenced riders today.
Yes, I mean, he came out of the French school in Samir, and part of that Army thing, and he rode in the Olympic Games. Was obviously a very good coach, very much cavalry oriented, of the pressure that he believed that people had to take. So it's a little bit of a militaristic side to it, which is probably not so popular today. And you either could take the pressure or you couldn't take the pressure, and his philosophy was like, if you can't take the pressure of me, you're not gonna be able to take the pressure of an Olympic Games. And that was absolutely his philosophy. And, I was lucky enough to have a personality that could see through, could deal with it. And I was there for 4.5 years, and got to deal with a lot of young horses, which was a blessing for me, I think. And so it was, it was the formative. It was the university. It was definitely, you were getting your, a bachelor's, master's degree at that side, and then you go on to study your PhD, with, in the sport and other people. But that was the formative university type of thing for me to learn the craft of, being in the sport. And, unfortunately, there's not a lot of that opportunities for a kid that didn't have any money. Because now they have to do it privately, and unless if somebody sponsors you, you have a hard, privately, which is what we do. We always sponsor kind of a kid. There's not a lot of those opportunities anymore.
That brings up an interesting point, because you brought up learning the craft, and then is learning the craft being separate from learning to be competitive as well, because Absolutely. There was a time span that you were just on top of the game, winning medals and Olympic gold individual and team medals. There was just and winning badminton. There's just a time span, and I'm interested to hear that portion of time. That was there a plan at that point? Like, you graduate from university and you're going, now I'm going to aim for a particular Olympic Games? Was it aiming for just being competitive and seeing where it happens? What was the outline to your plan?
I don't know if I've ever had anybody ask that question before. I think there's no question I was brought up in the Olympic program. Even from a child, I was around it. When I went to the team, you go to Jack, you are to ride he's not putting you on a team, but you are to be good enough to be on a team. That is the whole reason why you're there. Mm-hmm. And so the Olympic Games was always the goal. And you had to learn your craft. And I was lucky enough to learn the craft because it didn't have a lot of experienced horses to help you teach that craft. You had to learn it a little bit from the bottom. And the craft, you have to learn your craft because, I mean, I there was a wonderful saying, I think, of Mark Twain, basically said it's very, very important to have people learn the trade and not so they learn the tricks of the trade, which we see a lot of times now. We see learn the tricks of the trade and you don't learn the trade. So it's really important to learn the trade. And the trade is very, very, in horses, it's huge. But you have to learn the trade. And communicating with the horses has got to be number one. And how do we then be competitive? But the goal was always to try to produce, a level of your riding and the horses that you were around to be able to go to the Olympic Games. And that's where nobody can do this alone. This has to be your part, but you also have to put together and have people believe that anywhere from owners to vets, to blacksmiths, that everybody starts to put what I used to call a Formula One team, which doesn't make so much sense in America, but you put a NASCAR team together. And that NASCAR team is owners, sponsors, and they all believe in one mission. And that mission is to go do something. And you have to produce of competence that people believe. And the easy way is it's winning. The second part, there's a lot of people that want to be just part of a journey because it's winning. There's other people that just want to be part of the journey. And I would say that the people that I enjoyed the most were the people that wanted to be just part of the journey. But the goal was always to be competitive. It was never just to be okay. It was to go to represent and be good at that very, very top level and be what I would call a player on the world stage for a long time, multiple times, multiple horses. And you were one of the top 5 people that when you walked into a competition, you were one of those people that everybody knew was the player to, that you had to be competitive against. And that was a desire. There's no question. That was a drive. That was a drive. And there's probably a good, bad, and ugly part of that, but that was the drive of wanting to be one of the best in the world.
Yeah. But there was also a side to you that I've observed that you think outside the box quite a bit. And let's say that horse is not competitive now, but you're going to find a loophole where it can be competitive. And where when I met you, you were doing a lot of natural horsemanship. And yeah, and you've exposed another element to just training harder. You train smarter. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and how you came across, thinking outside the box, working in that way? And 2 of the biggest horses I remember you working with was Giltage and Custom Made. Very successful horses, team horses, individual horses. Tell us a little bit about your journey with that.
I'll back up all the way to the original story. I think as you put your life together, you realize how things happen, right? So I go all the way back to the trip across country. I spent a lot of time in the Western world, and you saw, people working horses, cattle, and you became interested. I learned how to rope when I was, I'll never forget it, actually, in the middle of Nebraska. And so I learned how to rope from Nebraska. And so I roped everything, every fence post, dandelion, whatever, rock, whatever, from Nebraska to Oregon. So you get interested in that stuff. And then I worked on a cattle ranch when I was 14 and 15 out in Laramie, Wyoming. And there was a cattle ranch that was dealt with horses. And so when you went into your competitive world and you bring all of these experiences with you, and bring the information from these other groups, these other people that are dealing with horses in so many other different ways. And I don't believe that yes, I got to go to the Olympic Games and did well, but I actually don't believe that I'm any better of a horseman than a lot of the people that would never be on television. They would be doing other sports or Western or even, or in any of the other disciplines that go down there. They don't have an Olympic venue to have that on TV, but these guys are fabulous horsemen. And so yeah. I think keeping your eyes open and watching and understanding. And so, I think that all things. So then I was in Utah with people that I'd been teaching with, and they were very supportive. And I met a guy named Gene Lewis. And Gene Lewis was a guy that on the West, he was one of the 2 top jumper trainers back in the 70s. And he grew up as a cowboy. His job, one of his first jobs was totally to start the Mustang horses that were wild, and they would bring them in, and the Army guy would show up, and he had to ride them 100 yards down, 100 yards back. And the Army guy would go, yes, yes, no, no, no. And those horses would all be shipped off to Fort Riley, and he would love it. So, and then he started jumping, and he took a lesson, and the guy said, don't lean that far forward, don't lean that far back. And that was the end of the lesson. But he brought all of the Western stuff too about jumping horses online. And this is where it all started. So you would jump horses on his rope, and he could do it from another horse. So he'd be cantering along, and this horse would be able to jump, like a triple combination, because he was so good with the rope and all that kind of stuff. And I was so fascinated by the horse, their ears and eyes, solving a puzzle and going down there and jump, and their bascule was amazing. So I said, I had to know about this. And I'd known him for a number of years. And so we went out one morning. There was literally one morning. And we were working, he was doing a horse online with a lariat, and he always made an Indian halter out of it and jumped. He goes, look for this, look for this, look for this, watch this. And then that was it. That was the lesson. And I spent the next, 6 or 7 years teaching myself how to do that, and what you learn and what you didn't, and the mistakes you make and all that kind of stuff. But it was still, it's had such an impact on my life, because I think of the 12 or 15 things that you need to learn how to do in order to jump a horse well online. Those will change how you deal with in the stable, how you deal with a trailer, how you deal with so many other different avenues about learning what pressure is and how pressure, so then where that leads is, what is pressure and how do we communicate with horses, and and the release of pressure, which is so incredibly important. And that's where the avenue, that's where the door opened up. And there was just the philosophy side of how do I apply that to what I want to do, which is a horse hunting a corner, which is basically it, because they're all going to go down there and jump a big table. But how does the horse look to a corner, to a narrow panel at the end of a combination, and he's like, that's where I'm going, instead of I'm forcing him to do that. He's going, he's hunting that. And that is where that whole avenue opened up. And I would say that the avenue opened up in broadening the aspect of how do we communicate with the pressure and release of pressure side of the equation, understanding that so much more, and then allowing that into the classic dressage and the classic show jumping and the classic fitness work that I had been taught for 25 years, and not replacing it, but adding into it. And that adding into it, a foundation that I had from Jack that could never be changed, and adding these pieces into it, that expanded a whole world that you don't let go of that part. You add into this. And it just still is a fascinating study. And every day it's a fascinating study. But you have to be open, I believe. You just have to be open to the world of how horses think. And I always say that in the end, it's our job to understand the horse's language. It's not their job to understand ours, right? Because we're speaking German or Slovenian or Russian or Spanish or whatever. So it's not their job to understand our language. It's our job to understand theirs. And that's a fascinating subject, never ending, because horses have a wide variety of personalities, just like people do. And so it's a never ending study that I find still fascinating to the day.
Yeah. Well, it creates such an outlet to learn endless things from a horse. And when you're competitive, you have to be open to learning. And it's just an amazing journey.
Yeah, I would also say that at the very, very top level, the horses love it, right?
Yeah.
You can't make it. You cannot make a horse jump around a 5-stroke.
No.
I don't care. I don't care who you are, right? You cannot make a horse do that. They've got to want to do it in the end. They love the game. They get competitive. As the 2 horses that you've talked about before, and others, the Wilton Fairs and the Automissions and the other horses that I've had over the years, they love the game. Gilt Edge was a classic example of that. Probably not the most talented horse in the world. Loved the game more than any other horse that they've had. Yeah, absolutely. And so
I saw you jump him without a bridle, with just a string around the neck, and you could tell he loved the show.
Well, the funny part about it is, like, the first time I'd ever ride him bridleless, I literally was in the ring and I just took his bridle off. Yes, he had done round pen work, and because that's kind of what we did, but we just took the bridle off, and custom made the same way, or these horses, Tigger too. They never knew the difference. Yeah. And then you learn so much about how they use themselves. I'm like, well, that's what I have to tap into instead of making them do. I got to tap into that because they already got a thing. So that's, again, it can sound a little bit off the wall in some ways, but in the end, it is a fascinating discovery journey that is never ending. And I do believe it has a huge impact on, and I think, horses being competitive at the top level because they are so full of wanting to play the game. So
you've always struck me as always being so positive. Have you had a major setback at one point, and how did you deal with it? Setbacks. How have you had a major setback at one point?
Well, I guess if you look at the perspective of life and all that kind of stuff, the setback is maybe not making Olympic Games when you thought you were going to. Like I was, we had this weird system in 1992 and going to Barcelona, and I beat the system. I was #1 system and all that kind of stuff. And the horse goes lame, a week before, so you don't go to the games. And you look back on it, you're like, that's a bad day. There's no question that's a bad day. But then you go back and you make a plan, you regroup. I think when you put the importance of what we do and the people that are around, the most important thing are the people. I think that's got to be #1. The people that we live with and the people that we get to do the journey with. That's still the things that you remember. The horses, the personalities of the horses ends up being so important. So you're still talking along the same levels. So I believe that is the most important thing. The setbacks, when you look back on it, I'll put it this way. I ride horses and train horses for a living. How do you justify that in the world?
Yeah.
This is what I do. I love what I do. Got taught what I do, and I get to do the thing that I got to love how to do. Yeah. And I'm still doing it. And so I don't know. But the setbacks they're minor. you know,
Just
there are
keep on.
injuries, there's things like that, but those aren't huge. You know, they're not huge in the perspective of things. I ride and train horses for a living. I mean,
speaking of which, you get to do it with your wife, Karen.
With Karen, exactly.
And to be able to stand on the podium together, that had to be a major highlight for the Atlanta Olympics. Standing on the podium next to the person that you live with to share that. What's the relationship like working in a competitive sport together?
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing because you get to do those highlights. And the everyday work is we're both doing the things that we love how to do. So you always like that. And so, but there has to be a line. We're two very uber competitive people. And so with that uber competitiveness, you have to make sure that there's a respect side of when somebody is going through their ups and downs and all that kind of stuff for trying things, you have to respect that. And so we always had two rules. The two rules were basically you never gave your opinion unless if you were asked. And that was number one rule. And then the second rule was if you were asked, then you had to hear it.
Yeah.
You had to stand there. You might not hear it, but you had to listen. And so those were the two rules. And I think that those rules have gone huge because because it's based on respect. Respect as an athlete, respect as a horseman, respect as a person, that you respect what they do. So if you were going through whatever and somebody like, you don't walk in there with your opinion right off the bat. You're like, well, they're working through it. And if they need help or whatever, then they're going to ask. And, but you don't give your opinion unless if you're asked. And I think that's a very important part of, there's a difference between the uber competitive side. The uber competitive side is it's a deal. When you talk to any track and field, you talk to, go listen to Michael Jordan, go listen to, like, there's a manic side to it. That manic side is in your head. So you have to make sure that you allow people to explore that and then be there when they need help, both ways, right? So it's not one way, that both ways, that you're like, okay, yeah, all right, this is what you think. But you're not walking in there with your opinion.
Yeah. And I'm sure being competitive, sometimes it's such a hunger that how do you look at the weakness and not sacrifice the horsemanship of being competitive? Is there a perspective that you share on that?
Yeah, there's my father actually always had great. He said something very strong to me. I can't remember what I was getting ready for, but I call up and then my parents were separated at that point, but I call up and I'm like, blah, 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 I'm having issues in my own head about getting ready for the championship that I'm getting ready. And he was like, well, don't ruin the 95%, just trying to get the 5%. And I'd never
remember you telling me that.
never forgot it. I mean, there has to be a level that the horse that, the horse has no idea that the Olympic Games are in 2 weeks, nor that they know or 3 months, or Kentucky is 2 weeks from now. They don't have that concept. And so you do, and you feel the pressure of that. But you must make sure that they are in a place that they understand it. And that's where I think that where we really try to go with the horses is that not just that they did it, but they understood it. And they understood the game, and they understood not that Kentucky was in 2 weeks, but they understood what was in front of them. And you always presented it that way. And, it takes growth. You made mistakes when you were a kid. You were too strong when you were a kid. There's no question. It wasn't all nirvana. But I think you get to the place, and I think passing that on to the next generation that's not a road that's going to get you there, is a lot because you've gone down that road. And there's not a horseman in the world. I don't care who you are. And no matter how, what your reputation is, there's not a person in the world, or horseman in the world, that hasn't regretted making a mistake with a horse at when they were coming on, and what made them learn that I will never do that again. These horses in the future I can be better than this. And I think that's a huge driving force.
When you retired from competing and went on to coaching, and an amazing coaching career with Canada, bringing them up to silver medal at the WEG, what were some of the challenges coaching today versus being the student back when you were with Jack? You mentioned it earlier. There was, it seemed like there was more behind the team back then versus today. Everyone's individually working and then happen to come together as a team later. Can you elaborate on that? Is there a bigger challenge today versus in the past as a team?
They're different. I think they're different challenges. The sport was so much smaller then. There was very much more focused. When you had, 10 events in the country compared to now, being down here in Florida, unlike the background, being down here in Florida where there's 400 or 500 horses running every single weekend. The sport has grown, the sport has changed. And the high performance had a lot more influence on the whole sport during that time than they do now. Because rightfully so, I think the main sport is that person that wants to enjoy the sport, and the high performance it's a small group. It should be an inspirational group. It should be, they are leading us into a place that where, attracts people to sport, but also, it's inspirational to watch them ride. And I think there are a lot of people that are very inspirational to watch the ride. But there's a whole side of the health thing, that to make sure that a team is based on, especially in the modern day sport, that is based on correct mechanics, the correct theory, and then the uber competitiveness takes that to the next level. I believe, sports are taught through technique and then theory and then instinct. And then you get into the two high performance things, which are more, the intuition and then the imagination. And that's the high performance more side of the sport. And the imaginations, start to see the field different. You start to see a dressage ring different. You start to see cross country. You see it. You see lines different. You see things like that. And that's the way sports go. But the basics have to be the same. The basics have to be really, really true, because there's the horse in the way that it is. It's like there's not a lot of new ideas in the last 300 or 400 years, except for the horse's mind, except the techniques of jumping and the things like that. Caprilli with his forward seat. These things have all evolved to make the horse compete better. But in the end, the exercises that you do and how you think about the theoretical side, I think and the technical side, really, really have to be so standard that then you can go and, do the top level. And it's like any other art form. You think about writing, you have to learn A, B, C's, right? You learn how to write letters and words and sentences. And music, the same way. You have to learn the basics of music, and then you go on and interpret it. Poetry. So in that part, it's the same. I think the basics have to be very, very, very true. And I think in the competitive world, that can be lost a little quicker than should be, because people are attracted by the competitive world. And Jack used to always talk to us about, people want to learn how to compete before they want to learn how to ride. And I really do believe that it should be the other way around.
Yeah. Now, coach, president, course designer, what one quality has horses taught you that helped you with all these careers that you're taking on?
Well, I don't know about the careers. I think you're just all in, right? And learning every aspect of the sport. So I'm really interested in what the judging point of view. I'm really interested in the course design because I think it makes me a better teacher, makes me a better rider, makes me a better person to try to get the next generation to understand. So the course design really started about making me a better rider. I enjoy it, but it really made me, when I started it back in the 90s, it was about making me a better rider, to understand that side of the equation. What are we doing? And then the other side of the equation is right from the beginning. My mother was very involved in Pony Club, helped start the U.S. Dressage Association, was, instrumental in USETA. So we were always taught to give back right from the beginning. I mean, we were always. And then, then you had a mentor like Jimmy Wofford, a big administrator himself, and the people that you're around, Roger Haller. Roger Haller wrote the rule books for eventing when he was 24 years old.
Wow.
And so you were tapped on the shoulder and you were saying, hey, you need to do this and you need to start now because it's going to take you 10 or years to, learn how to do it, and especially in the administrative world now. And so, but you were tapped on the shoulder by somebody. And I believe in tapping the people that I work with now, tap on the shoulder. You got to, Lauren Kiefer is now on the board of the US, of USEA. So you have to, and Lynn Szymanski is, chairman of the Active Riders. So I think you have to, because the sport, in the end, the sport's small.
Right.
It's small.
Right.
We're, if we got 14, 15,000 members, we got maybe 10,000 people playing at a time, probably have 250,000 people that are interested in it. This is a country of 320 million. And so the sport is small. And so if we don't take care of it of our own, it goes away. And I believe that needs to be taught young, very young. And the volunteer side is huge. And so when I was president of the Federation, that's volunteer. I'm chairman of the FEI eventing committee, because blah, 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 blah. It's all volunteer. Yeah. It's volunteer jobs to try as to the best of whatever ability you have and with no ego in the slightest about it to say, I'm going to try to help to make the sport go on and pass it on to the next generation. But you have to. I was brought up that way, and I just totally believe you have to give back. You have to jump in and be caretakers of the sport so that the next generations can play it. As my career is, it was amazing. It's been fantastic. And I learned more off of all of the volunteer stuff that I do than I ever give. I think I learn more off of it from the people that you get to deal with, who are some of the smartest people ever from any aspect. And you learn so much from them that you get a kick out of it. And people can agree with some of the decisions or not, or what, but in the end, all you're trying is full-heartedly to make the sport a better thing and pass it on. Period.
David, that is probably the greatest advice that we could give to our listeners. And it's something that we wrapped up with Denny Emerson when we talked about what attributes do great horsemen have. And we wrapped it up with giving back to the sport. We have a huge responsibility behind the sport.
We all have to be caretakers. We have to be.
Yeah. No. And I really appreciate you spending this time with us. Please check out David's website with Team O'Connor. They have lots of up and coming riders, horses. Karen's always busy, clinician. Your students are always giving back as well. I remember Max is president of the USEA. So, yeah, it's fantastic. And I really appreciate you taking the time out to sharing your story. And I look forward to someday that you write a book. So I know Jimmy's on you about writing a book.
Yeah, Jimmy's on me all about that. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, you have a great story to share. So
Well,
really appreciate it. Thank you very much, David.
thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, they're just funny stories of a life.
Yeah. On behalf of IDCTA, I want to thank you for being part of this tonight. And I'm sure everyone has enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thanks. Great, Eric.
Good night.
Good night.